Thank you all for joining us for this evening's event, the Chemistry of Cocktails, organised by IFST Eastern Branch. I'm Bob Bowman, your host for this evening. At the beginning of my career, I worked in the food industry for some 25 years after graduating in 1970. And for the past 25 years, I've worked as a freelance technical consultant. I'm chair of IFST Eastern Branch and a fellow of the Institute, having been a member for must be nigh on 50 years. This evening, we're delighted to have Steve Pearce, CEO and founder of Omega Ingredients Limited, worldwide innovators and creators of specialist aromas, flavours and ingredients, as our speaker. Steve is a biochemist, a chartered scientist and fellow of the Royal Society of Chemistry, a member of the British Society of Perfumers, past president of the British Society of Cosmetic Scientists, and past president of the British Society of Flavourists. Steve is also one of the first people to be awarded the title Certified Food Scientist by the Institute of Food Technology in the USA. Steve is an advisor to a diverse range of commercial clients, specializing in creating unique ingredients and flavors for food and drink manufacturers. Steve is no stranger to IFST, having presented his popular Chemistry of Cocktails roadshow to various branches and at the IFST Jubilee Spring Conference dinner in 2014, for which he created a special IFST Jubilee cocktail. So we're delighted for him to be back to present his roadshow to a virtual audience this evening. So those of you who have purchased cocktails to try during Steve's talk can relax and enjoy without having to drive home. Steve's talk will include case studies for each of the varieties included in the pack, so please hold back and wait for them to pop up before trying. Please post any photographs of you at our event today or photos of you enjoying your cocktails and tag IFST on Instagram, Facebook or Twitter, or email us at events@ifst.org, as we would love to see them. At the end of this evening's presentation, Carol Raithatha, committee member of IFST's Sensory Science Group and IFST's Eastern Branch, will host a Q&A session. For those sampling cocktails, I suggest you submit your questions early while you can still type coherently. Carol will ask Steve your questions and we'll wrap up the proceedings at 7:30 p.m. sharp. So over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Bob. Much appreciated for that. Okay, for those of you sitting at home and got your cocktails ready, the first one we're going to look at is to help the evening get off to a good start is going to be the matcha mojito that you should have. So just pour over ice and enjoy. Everything you want is in there for that perfect mojito. Okay, and don't forget, we're talking recycled straws these days, so good luck. So the origin of cocktails. While you're looking at this mojito, take ourselves back to the 16th century. British sailors sailing the world, dominating the world. And what happened was, of course, the British Navy soon realized the water on board for a long journey went off quickly. So what they did next was replace it with beer. Of course, that went off fairly quickly as well on a long journey. But having discovered the West Indies and this fantastic product that they were making from fermented cane sugar out there, this rum, they decided it would be a good idea to replace that water and that beer with some rum. So each of the sailors got given a pint of rum. Now, a pint of rum a day for these sailors, all they were doing was drinking the rum, and then not much else was happening after that. So the Navy decided that what they should do is start diluting it down. Now, what you get, first of all, would be a daiquiri. So you would get a nice daiquiri, a simple product made from just rum, sugar, and some lime juice. And of course, the Navy had discovered by then that a bit of lime juice, the vitamin C, prevented scurvy in the Navy. But they needed to dilute it back. So they would dilute it back dilute it back. So again, the sailors wouldn't become so intoxicated. But of course, the sailors wanted some proof here that they hadn't been diluted back so far. And there was no analytical equipment. There was nothing else to measure the density of the product and the alcohol. So what did they have on board ship but gunpowder? So this is where we get Navy strength alcohol from, Navy strength rum. So it was found that you could only dilute back to 57% alcohol, and that level, the gunpowder would still ignite. Hence, that became known as the Navy strength alcohol level, 57%. So you'll see that still today on some rum, some gins, they will talk about Navy strength. That's exactly where that comes from. And of course, it's also where the word proof in this respect comes from. So the sailors wanted proof that it hadn't been diluted too far, and the British called 57% alcohol 50 proof. The Americans, needing a bit of help with their maths, probably decided that that would be 100, and 100% alcohol would be 200 proof. So, origin of the cocktail, some of this probably goes back to the sailors, but we can see first mentions in literature around about 1821. And in 1936, an actual Bartender magazine refers to these British sailors' drinks in the West Indies being served this cola de gallo, or a cock's tail, and therefore maybe that's the origin. And we'll come to another couple of stories about this. Next slide, please. So again, in this case, it's about election fever in the USA, and this story about a newspaper up in New York State talking about the Democratic election, and having one bar having made a cocktail as a stimulating drink with all matter of spirits and botanicals in it, to embolden the heart and befuddle the head during an election, and said to be of particular use to a Democratic candidate, because anyone that will swallow a glass of it will swallow anything. I think we've just been through that in the USA again, haven't we? Okay, next slide. So the first bartender, people like Jerry Thomas, for example, and his blue blazer. And the blue blazer wasn't a very nice jacket that he was wearing. It would be this fantastic example of pouring a whiskey cocktail that was actually on fire from one hand to another, and creating this arc of blue flame. I was doing this lecture at the Science Festival in Edinburgh a few years ago, and I was asked if we might do this on stage, but you can imagine pretty quickly they clamped down from the insurance point of view and said it wasn't something they wanted to see me do. And actually, Jerry Thomas was chased out of a couple of towns where he set fire to bars doing exactly this. So he was the first people, so he wrote books on this, and he put cocktails together, and was one of the first people to turn this into a bit of a show. Next slide. Johnson, around about the same time, actually start writing manuals to bartenders, probably with a bit of a warning that perhaps carrying out the blue blazer type technique was not the kind of thing to do if you wanted to have a long career in this. And Boothby's American Bartender, which was published in 1891, became a bit of a handbook as well. Next slide, please. We're aware of the prohibition in the USA and what that did to alcohol sales. And I'm hearing similar things. You know, we've just had, of course, everyone will be aware of what's happening with the coronavirus and COVID-19. When they did the lockdown in South Africa, they also banned alcohol sales. And they found that during that period where they banned the alcohol sales and had the lockdown, they've decreased hospital admissions for all kinds of things, from crimes, from assaults, by 40%. All these things being caused by consumption of alcohol. So it's quite interesting that that was the kind of thing that was driving this prohibition demand in the USA. And of course, we've seen plenty of movie references to the smuggling of spirits, importing spirits from Ireland and from Canada, or even making some themselves. And even during that time, it was such poor quality that other things would be added to it. So we'd add fruit juices and other things. And so actually, instead of drinking neat spirits, it would be the cocktail that was the preferred option. Next slide, please. And lots of stories during that time as well about how suddenly lots of people in California, for example, signed up to Catholic churches where there was no ban on serving wine, for example. And of course, in popular culture, we see the origin and the demand for cocktail being driven by things like the Sex and the City series, where Carrie Bradshaw, the main character, would order these cocktails, the famous cocktail that she would order every bar that she went to, the Cosmopolitan. Next slide, please. But we can actually trace some of this back quite a long way. And the first recorded example of a mixture of botanicals, for example, is actually something some of us grew up with, the dandelion and burdock type product. But famously here we have Pimm's, again in the UK, something that was developed to eat in oyster bars in London. Very interesting, very complex. Even including things like jasmine, for example. Now, you would never drink it and say that you're intrigued by the jasmine note, but it adds complexity and adds a lot of character to the product. And Drambuie, you know, famously created from herbs and materials that were available in Scotland or imported from France when they were fighting the English, in order to give the clansmen courage with this powerful alcoholic beverage full of these natural botanical extracts as well. Next slide. What we now know is that what intrigues us about this is this different balance of sweetness and savouriness, and also the bitterness that goes on in consuming a cocktail. And we now know that these sort of typical balance would be something like 3 parts of the spirit to 2 parts of the sweet component, and that could be juice, for example, and 1.5 parts of the sour. Now that could also be a contribution from the juice, but typically lemon, lime, other botanical products that might elicit some kind of bitterness in the mouth or stringency, things like that, to counteract the sweetness. And it's about getting that balance right. So we see this kind of mix being the sort of ultimate sort of blend of materials, and even making savory, you know, maybe tomato-based cocktails, for example, and cocktails that include smoky bacon and extracts of vegetables like that, beetroot, can really enhance this type of character as well. Next slide, please. And of course, there are cocktails that are hot. I've done shows with other mixologists who've created cocktails which they've cooked in the microwave to prepare them. So they've been warm cocktails. But often we think about them being served with ice, either crushed ice or with ice cubes. And something to remember, of course, is you really should make your ice cubes from good quality fresh water to make the ice. And remember not to, if you're making this at home, not to put your frozen prawns in the same compartment as your ice cubes. That's not the flavor you're looking for when you present a guest with a nice cocktail, even if it is something as simple as a gin and tonic, let's say. And ice, if you're not careful, can really carry those off notes into your cocktail. And of course, it can also dilute your product. So you may want to carry 1 big ice cube for serving with things like a Negroni, for example. You don't want to dilute it, but you want to keep it cool. Next slide. And again, that's the point. It might be a good idea to chill all your ingredients beforehand and not necessarily dilute them by shaking them over ice. I mean, that might be something you want to look at. And remembering as well that being cold, and those of you that are in the food industry or the beverage industry in particular will recognize that if we can keep things cool, ice creams, for example, or just keeping the beverage cold and serving it cold, we can reduce the perception of some of those off notes that might be formed during storage, for example. And so that's a good thing to recognize. Next slide, please. And it's this type of thing. So typical breakdowns, these cardboardy type notes like noninenal, for example, can be really suppressed by keeping the product cold. So important to recognize that. Don't carry it through from your ice. Next slide, please. And again, it's how cold can we get? So you may try just shaking and shaking over ice as much as you can. You're really not going to get much below -7 centigrade. And that's pretty good when you consider the ice itself may have come out of your freezer at something like -18, but will start to melt at probably -4, something like that. So that's pretty good. And of course, using CO2, dry ice, can really help you get to lower levels, but you have to be very careful with it. Lots of stories around about people using dry ice to prepare cocktails with and actually killing people because it's frozen in their throat because they've just overdone it. So a small amount, quite interesting to make some things very cold, but don't overdo it. Next slide, please. The order of addition when you're well can be really interesting and important to think about the density of products, and particularly if you're looking to do any kind of layering or to have things float on the surface. This is also another good reason why you may want to chill your components and just increase their density a little if you're looking to have them settle at the bottom of your vessel. So that's a good thing. So think about the density of your materials, what's going to be on the top. You can create some nice effects. Next slide, please. And colorful layering effects like this. So think about the options and the density of the products and just carefully pouring them into the glass. So anything like that helps, and you can have some great fun experimenting with these items. Next slide, please. Okay, here we come. If we were doing this live, we would have presented you at the beginning, and as you heard from Bob, I have done this to a few locations. We would have presented you at the beginning with a cocktail, a vodka martini. Some of it would have been shaken, some of it would have been stirred, and we would have tried to find out from the audience whether you could notice a difference. So famously, James Bond, a character created by Ian Fleming, is believed to have ordered his vodka martini shaken, not stirred. And we believe that the reason for that was that Ian Fleming experienced in the 50s and the 40s these crudely distilled potato origin oily vodkas. And it was felt that shaking it over ice quite vigorously would help disturb that, maybe even trap some of the oils onto the ice and therefore smooth it out. And that's where that comment came from. So what we normally find though, next slide please, is whilst everyone might have their preference, actually it's very difficult to distinguish. And in every case that I've ever done this experiment with audiences, even around 100 people, it really is 50-50. So there's no conclusive decision to say that it's better shaken or better stirred these days. Of course, we've got triple distilled vodkas, we've got vodkas that have been through freezing processes now and removing the oils or any impurities like that. So we've got far better, more pure products to work with. So that's one advantage that we've got in this respect, and probably accounts for the fact that we're not seeing that difference. Next slide, please. What does James Bond really drink though? So of course in the movies they went for the vodka martinis. It was just the way it caught on. But if you read the books and if you follow the history, James Bond preferred drink originally was a Scotch and soda. In the books he drinks gin martinis rather than vodka, but he's tried a lot of other things as well, and you'll see these mentioned at various times during the movies even. And of course it depends on what part of the world he might be operating in, whether he's having a mojito or a rum Collins or a Negroni, for example. But worth looking back on that. Some great cocktails there that get mentioned. Next slide, please. Possibly the oldest cocktail, and certainly the claim is for the Sazerac, with an origin in New Orleans, but I've been in other parts of the USA, out in the Midwest and the South Midwest, that also have a claim for this. And some interesting stories about how this comes about being made by an apothecary. And again, you know, we know that things like Pepsi Cola and Coca-Cola were made by a pharmacist or an apothecary working, trying to use botanicals to create an energy drink, for example. And this was no different. So Antoine Peychaud, who created Peychaud's bitters made from various botanicals, the idea being that he could have this in his bar, in his restaurant. And possibly this was also another story behind where the word cocktail came from. If you can imagine that coquetier or coquette became cocktail, that's a possibility. Very interesting recipe, something that everyone should try at least once with the Peychaud bitter, and starting with having things like the rye whiskey in there and a dash of absinthe. It is really an intriguing blend and beautifully complex. So again, it would be something I would love to be making for you here as a live audience and serving some of this right now. But you're just going to have to use your imagination. Next slide, please. And of course, it becomes called the official state cocktail of Louisiana. And so the suggestion here is that you would even be told at school how to make it. It becomes such an important part of the culture in some parts of the USA. Next slide, please. And here's the recipe. So by all means, we can make this available to you, but I'm sure you can look this up. And certainly the absinthe that coats the glass. So you would pour some into the glass, swirl it around, pour it back into the bottle. So you've just got a layer, but start with the sugar cube with the Peychaud's bitters in there, and then the bourbon. So depending on what you would use, but usually something like the Buffalo Trace would be a really popular example to use in that to make a wonderful product. Yeah, next slide, please. So I keep mentioning botanicals used for various effects in beverages. So the dandelion and burdock we mentioned earlier with the fennel in it. We've got, of course, popular soft drinks like Coke and Pepsi that contain extracts of cinnamon and vanilla and citrus notes, notes of ginger and so on. And we've mentioned, of course, already the Pimm's and the Drambuie. But of course, what's really popular at the moment are the botanicals that we tend to use in gin. And to be called gin, it has to contain juniper. And of course, again, big demand for botanicals for using them to create effects, to change the mouthfeel, increase bitterness, or have other effects in the mouth as well. So really interesting use. It's been around a long time. Next slide, please. And of course, a lot of factors driving the interest now. We have a strong low and no demand for creating cocktails and other alternative beverages, adult beverages, with no sugar, no alcohol, or low sugar, low alcohol. And for a lot of reasons, people who just want to avoid alcohol for health reasons, fitness reasons, religious reasons, of course, the designated driver. So very important. And this is where a lot of these botanicals can play a big role in creating complex adult non-alcoholic beverages, non-alcoholic cocktails made in this way. So adding, they're seen, of course, being natural as being healthier, being a preferred option. They can add a lot of flavor and aroma enhancement. That's a really important aspect. And the mouthfeel and bitterness masking. It can help with the labeling, so you can create a product that has a very nice, clean label effect. The functionality of the product, is it stimulating? Is it relaxing? Is it helping with something else? And of course, traditionally, a lot of these products were extracted or distilled in alcohol, so their prime use was in alcoholic beverages like Pimm's and hundreds of other alcoholic concoctions that occur right across Europe. And now what we're having to do is take some of those traditional methods and somehow extract good quality botanical effects, aromas and flavors without the use of alcohol, so we can use them in low and no options and broaden their use. So it's a very interesting part of the business and the industry at the moment that has just grown over the last 5 years or so with the advent of products like Seedlip and Cedars and similar products to that. Next slide, please. This is typical of what you might find in Hendrick's gin, for example. So starting with juniper as the main note, and then a lot of other complexity driving the flavor of the product. So, and of course, again, as I was suggesting earlier with the Pimm's, you don't taste the Pimm's and talk about the jasmine note. You may taste this gin and not necessarily talk about the fact that you're picking out the depth of the rose note or the orris or the angelica, for example. But if you remove any one of them, the product changes and they work beautifully together. And that's something that sometimes you have to discover almost just by trial and error, just by chance, to decide what you're going to use and at what level. And of course, Hendrick's is well known for its cucumber note as well. So that's a really distinctive option that they've chosen to set their brand apart. But given the amount of botanicals that we have access to, it's no wonder that we have hundreds of different gins, all using the same similar kind of botanical extracts, but we're creating different effects. Next slide, please. And we're getting these raw materials. We here at Omega make a lot of extracts, distillates, use all kinds of technology for extracting the right kind of material. And what we've learned is not only do the raw material sources change from plant to plant, so whether you're getting the botanical you want from a flower or a bark or a bud or a berry, but also depends on what extraction technology we might use, whether it might be some form of distillation or percolation, whether it might be CO2 extraction, and just sometimes just simple steeping together to create the right kind of impact. Not every technique works with every botanical. You have to find the right one that gets you the right product, gets you the right level of flavor. And particularly now that we're talking about using these products for low and no applications, where we want to keep the alcohol level 0 or as low as possible, that makes it even trickier and means that we're investing in new types of technology in CO2 extraction and other very, very careful molecular distillation methods to make really powerful high value extracts. Next slide, please. So yeah, so steam distillation would probably have been part of the original traditional technologies going back some hundreds of years, thousands of years, let's say, and that's something that's still carried out today. Creating tinctures, which would just simply be a solution in alcohol. It may be something that's simply soaked in alcohol overnight, or it may be that you leave it in an alcohol bath for some time in order to get the right effect, to get the right level of extraction. And then to use extraction methods on solids, may be a combination of ethanol and water. It could contain sugar, it could contain glycerol in some of these extraction methods, anything that would change the solvent character to help you get to the right product. And hydrolates, the water that's left over from the steam distillation, can be a really good area for getting interesting characters, particularly from fruit, where fruit is processed in a plant to make fruit concentrates. This sometimes you can find that the water that's taken out during that concentration process can be very useful, and equally from the steam distillation to make essential oils. So condensing that water to separate the oil, the water is still saturated with some interesting botanical compounds from the original botanical starting material. Next slide, please. When we're looking at these botanicals, though, we have to be really careful to make sure that what we're selecting is exactly what we're aiming for it to be. So often you have to find a supplier that's training their pickers or their handlers well to make sure that product is sourced correctly, that when they're picking product that's growing in a field, that they're picking the correct product and making sure that that's right. Of course, these days as well, we have lots of legislation about the status being whether products are natural, and that may depend on the solvents that we're using or the technology. As long as we're sticking with physical extraction, distillation techniques using alcohol and water, we're probably okay. And organic, of course. So again, sticking with organic materials, organic certification, handling the product in the right way. And again, helping the customer make the right kind of declarations, particularly the low and no aspect of it, and anything, of course, that contains alcohol. Traditionally, we're able to hide the contents under that legislation. There's no need for declaration. But if we've got interesting botanicals in there, we may want to sing about them. We may want to attract our audience and our customers by talking about some of the key things that we've got in there, but whilst hiding some of the others in the legislation. Next slide, please. So let's talk about some cocktail recipes and their complexity. So we talked about that ratio and that blend, creating a kind of effect of bitterness, sweetness, and alcohol in the mouth. So one of the most popular beverages, and rumor has it that on airlines, air hostesses hate the first person that asks for a Bloody Mary, because then everyone else asks for one, and it's so time consuming for them to be able to create this effectively. And again, it's a nice savory cocktail with a lot going on. So here, typically, tomato juice is the savory aspect of it, but the tomato juice having some acid, having some sweetness, and definitely having some compounds in there that can give that nice, rich mouthfeel, the umami effect. Some lime juice or some lemon juice would traditionally be added to give some acidity. And of course, the key spirit would be the vodka. So very important. And Worcester sauce, when we come to add that, one of the reasons we're doing that again is not just that complexity from the botanicals and the spice extracts that are in there, but the fact that it contains anchovy. And anchovy is one of the richest natural sources of monosodium glutamate. So again, we're adding to the depth of the savory character here and that nice, deep, mouth-filling umami effect. Celery, either served in the glass or celery salt used, maybe in the blend as well. Very important. Important flavor enhancing compounds called phthalides that come out of celery. Really interesting, but have an addition to the complexity. And then we're going to add different levels of heat. So there's a little bit coming from the Worcester sauce, and then you're going to add some Tabasco, you know, and then some black pepper. So different levels of heat that work in a different way. And this is why we might say that this is a really complex cocktail in terms of what happens in the mouth. So let's have a look at that. Next slide, please. So taste perception. So you may get told, you may recall from being at school that there was basically just sweet, sour, bitter, and salty effects that is what you experienced in the mouth. And of course, we now know, and those of us that work in the flavor industry know, that everything we experience as flavor pretty much is all about the aroma. What happens is in the mouth is still very important and still interesting though, because that tells us things like the heat of the product, the smoothness. And by heat, I mean hot and cold, the smoothness, the crunchiness, and of course, things like the sourness, the saltiness, and the bitterness and the sweetness of the product. Also now we know about the umami effect, this rich mouth-filling effect that's related to monosodium glutamate, so glutamate ions in the mouth. We now also know that there's a taste sensation that detects carbonation, and we have the kokumi effect, which is all about fullness and richness in the mouth. So other nucleotides that affect that. So there's a lot going on here, and I think this helps explain why, when we've got these things in a cocktail, those umami type characters coming from the monosodium glutamate, coming from the celery compounds, coming from the use of the anchovy in the Worcester sauce, this is what makes this a really, really complex and interesting product. So next slide, please. And there's important reasons why we have these characteristics in the mouth, so that we're aware that we need salt to survive and to keep nerve senses working correctly in the right degree of blood pressure. And the sourness is a very important aspect to avoid irritation and poison. So we're hardwired to react to sourness and bitterness in the mouth, because it might indicate that we're attempting to eat a poisonous product. And again, why would we have a carbonation sensor in the mouth? Again, it's about detecting fermentation, which may be an indication of things being poisonous. So having these abilities in our senses as we were developing as man obviously gave us an advantage, a selective advantage. So really important. And the umami effect, why would we want to have this umami effect? Well, it's about taking on board protein, about taking on glutamic acid and detecting protein in the diet. So very important. But the fact that we've got this sourness and bitterness detection in the mouth, which is about the hard wiring telling us that we may be being poisoned, means that these characters we can play with in cocktails and in other areas to give us some excitement. And it may be that to begin with, you're a bit concerned that maybe I am being poisoned, but actually the truth is you suddenly realize that no, this is an enjoyable experience. So you have that frisson, if you like, of the deep down of thinking, wow, you know, this is dangerous, it's exciting, but actually, of course, it's safe. Next slide, please. And again, I know a lot of you are food scientists probably watching this, and you're well aware of this, but our sense of smell is goes directly into the brain. It's really, really powerful, and it hits those centers of memory for example, so we can, and emotions, so that we can very, very quickly react to this. So again, that's to do with the aroma, but also the complete olfactory system with the taste and the aroma of the materials can create a very quick reaction, bring back memories, but also lay down a memory of excitement as well, and of pleasure. So this is a really important aspect, again, of why cocktails that have that complex mixture, that have that excitement about them, and maybe just tempting that risk button that says you're being poisoned, can lead to that excitement. Next slide, please. So back to the Bloody Mary. What we have when you start to drink the Bloody Mary is this whole unveiling of the complexity of the product. So getting things like the acidity, for example, from the lemon juice early on, getting that, and then that slowly building up as you get the sensory, the savory notes from the tomato juice, and you get the other compounds beginning to come in, and then different levels and different types of heat coming in at a different time. So it just keeps on giving. So it's not just one note, it's something that builds up and builds up. And as the layers build up, you get a more and more complex flavor. And that's why this is believed to be this really complex, intriguing, and much liked cocktail. Complexity and the way that the flavor compounds from the celery and sauce, for example, really build up the layer. Add in a bit of horseradish, for example, on top of your black pepper and your Tabasco, and you've got another of heat and another type of heat that's affecting the whole product and delivering those earthy notes and umami type effect. So again, I would be loving to have created one for you here and have you taste it, but you've got to do this at home and look at that and play with those notes and see how it unveils itself as you drink it and as you experience it. Next slide, please. A few years ago, we worked on a product which was a distillate of wasabi, and created the Bloody Samurai, so the revenge of the samurai, if you like, in terms of really creating a very kick-ass type Bloody Mary, in this case, the Bloody Samurai. So adding in some of this wasabi spirit, so effectively a really powerful product that contains some wasabi and there's beautiful earthy notes to it as well. So adding to that vegetable-like character. And in traveling the world, I'm lucky to do that and to go and try bars in different places and sit with bartenders in hotel bars and on airlines and things like that and talk to them about the composition of their Bloody Mary. And every mixologist and every bartender, they'll have their little secrets and their little ways of doing it. So here's a couple to share with you. So even in your traditional Bloody Mary, is try just adding a little shot of something like some sherry into that mix, just to add that smoothness, just to add that extra little something that's in there, that fermented product that's been aged in a barrel that's got some other notes to it. In this case, I'm adding some sake into it, making that, really the samurai type effect. So putting some sake in there and as well as the wasabi spirit, and making sure that we've got everything in there. And in this particular case, just because I could, I changed the black pepper for white pepper, just to give a slightly different character to it as well. So a really interesting take on it, in my opinion. I still have some of this left. If anybody wanted to try it at some point, we could certainly send you some. But a really interesting take on it, and boy, did it have a kick. Thanks very much for that. Next slide, please. So a little while ago, we were playing with these ideas and saying, this doesn't just have to be about beverages. It doesn't just have to be, looking at these traditional things like a Bloody Mary or a gin and tonic or whatever it might be. But could we make it replicate the flavor of a food stuff in a cocktail? And so we've got this. You can actually get this yogurt liquor made by Bowls, for example, but put that together with some peach schnapps and a bit of lemon juice, stir it with a bit of ice, serve it. So you would maybe filter it with through one of your little filters, so that you make sure that you hold back all the ice. It really does taste like a cheesecake in a glass. A very interesting product, quite fascinating. Again, happy to share with any of you the recipe if you're scrambling to write it down now, but really interesting. Your difficulty might be finding that Bowls yogurt liqueur, but I'm sure you could probably get it online. An interesting thing to serve to guests, and particularly even as a dessert, let's say, here's cheesecake for dessert in a glass. Next slide, please. Now we come to the niche cocktails. This is a local company to us here in Suffolk. And when they approached us a couple of years ago, they wanted to make the best cocktails in a can. And the idea behind this was that this would enable the busy bartender in a pub or a bistro or somewhere like that to quickly serve, as you found earlier, just quickly to put yourself a mojito together, pour it over ice, put a straw in it, maybe a slice of lemon or so, in this case, a sprig of mint, your job's done. But they wanted it to be right. They wanted it to be like the real thing, and not an imitation, not made with a flavor, but made with botanicals, made with good quality rum, and the right kind of ABV that you would expect, the right kind of alcohol kick that you would expect if you had this served to you in a bar. And that's what we've done. So those of you, hopefully, that have tried this, now you can recognize that. It's got a nice character. And I mentioned earlier the botanicals that we're using. We're very keen on the provenance. We want to know where these products came from, how they got selected, how they got processed, where they came from. So we're able to say that the mint in this product came from Egypt, that the lime comes from Brazil, for example. And of course, the matcha tea extract that we've made that goes into this actually comes from Japan. So we're able to do that and to give all that to the customer and to create a wonderful product like this. So I hope you're enjoying it. It is a lovely product. Of course, now you've seen where to get it. I hope you might get some more. Next slide, please. So the next product, this one, slightly different take. So instead of rum, we're talking about gin. And again, the aspect of this was creating this. So we looked at how this product or something similar would be served in a bar. And we looked to see how that, what kind of products might be used, and to give it the right kind of character, the right degree of sweetness and acidity and bitterness. So of course, grapefruit has all of that in it. It's quite sour, it can be quite bitter, it has some sweetness. So that was really interesting to play with that and to get that to match well. And then to add in the complexity by adding in these other products, and then just enhance the color with a little bit of vegetable extract to give the color. But the use of the Angostura bark extract to enhance the bitterness and to really develop the depth of the flavor in a product like this. And as soon as you start combining botanicals like this and the products that I've mentioned earlier, as soon as you start working with these products and combining and creating something new, you never know what's going to happen. So it can be quite intriguing as well to suddenly find that you're getting some interesting interactions between some of the products. Sometimes it's negative and you have to change your plans a bit, but sometimes it's a really positive effect. And when you get the chance, the opportunity to try this, and maybe if I've been talking enough now, you've graduated from the mojito to the nice pink grapefruit gin fizz, beautiful, refreshing product. Next slide, please. And in this case, again, a very interesting take that we've created on the coffee-based liqueur type cocktail. In this case, a martini, a mocha martini. So again, the provenance of this product was about getting the right kind of coffee character to make this cold brew extract of good quality Colombian coffee, to talk about the provenance, to talk about the variety that we're using. Good quality, of course, vodka, but again getting the cocoa extract, so using cocoa from Indonesia in this case, so really nice product. And then we've created, on top of the fact that we've got a nice strong product that's delivering a lot of alcohol effect, a nice character from the cold brew Colombian coffee and the mocha flavor in there as well, was to create, how do we create something that can be served in a can that somebody can just open and pour over some ice and still have this nice layer on top that is creamy and rich. So we developed a product from some botanicals, which we've called Omega Foam, and this creates that effect and creates that nice serving experience. So something that we've done for this customer, for this client, for Niche Cocktails, to make a wonderful product that's selling very well for them. And again, when you get to that, maybe you can end the evening with this one if you still feel like a drink. I think this would be a good way to finish the evening. Next slide, please. So where do we go from here? Getting towards the end of the show here. So probably the best fictional cocktail. So for fans of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, this gets a mention in there, including the description of the ingredients that should go in there. So if you can read this, take the juice from one bottle of that old jank spirit, pour into it 1 measure of water from the seas of Santraginus 5. Allow 3 cubes of Arcturian megagin to melt into the mixture. It must be properly iced or the benzene is lost. You can see where this is going. Allow 4 liters of Phalian marsh gas to bubble through it. So I took this recipe and created our own version, something that would back up these back of a silver spoon float a measure of quailactin hypermin extract and so on. So we've done that, and I'm going to make this for you now. It would be something that I would love you to be here to see and to taste and experience, but I'm going to give you the recipe in a moment as well. So next slide, please. And for those of you that are fans of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you may remember that this was how the impact of drinking this product was described. And I'm not saying mine is as bad as that, but it's a pretty impressive effect, I have to say. So if we go to the recipe, next slide, please. So looking at those ingredients, I wanted something to help create this. So this is what I've done, is put some of this together. So the sweetness, looking at the chemistry and the effects that we were talking about earlier, the sweetness is coming from some nice peach schnapps, for example, and a nice character as well. We've got some orange juice in here to add that acidity and that fruitiness. And then we've got some nice peaty. I know some of you at home will be saying, oh no, don't tell me he's going to use a really good whiskey in that. But yes, a beautiful peaty whiskey is going to go into the other half of this recipe and is going to help us create this effect. And of course, this is giving us that fantastic mix of sort of that phenol, smoky type character that you would expect to get into something like this. And then finally, what we've got, it's not just for show, but here we go with the blue curacao. So we want a nice colorful impact, don't we? So that's where we're going with this. And it's going to make it another degree of sweetness to it. And of course, we've got the olives. So we're not going to forget the olives. We're going to put the olives in our glass as we're going to serve this. So we'll drop in a couple of olives in there, I think, maybe 3 just for good measure. And we'll see where we're going. So I'm going to give this a shake up. Okay, next slide, please. So get ready for your applause. And I think we can lose that one now. Okay, we ready? Okay, here we go. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the Galactic Gargle Blaster. Cheers. Thanks very much. I'm sure you're all applauding. I just can't hear you.